Okay, I think we're going to get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to Grand Rounds today. I usually try to keep introductions very, very brief, but there's several really exciting announcements today, so bear with me. First, for departmental announcements, next week's Grand Round is going to be Geraldine Dawson from Duke, who will be talking about her work on autism. So everyone is welcome to please come. Second, in honor of Black History Month, the Medical Center has organized an interdepartmental celebration of diversity under the sponsorship of the Kenneth A. Forday Diversity Alliance. There's several events that have been planned around that, one of them being our Grand Rounds today with Dr. Cristiane Duarte, but then also there's a pediatrics Grand Rounds on February 8th by Malika Fair. She'll be giving a talk entitled, "What's in Your Doctor's Bag? Building a Medical Career to Advance Health Equity." There's also a bunch of other related events, and so if you're interested in more information, Dr. Jean Marie Bradford can provide that for you. So next, we have a very special announcement, in that it's our great privilege and honor to celebrate and acknowledge the achievements of one of our very own emeritus faculty, Dr. Hector Bird, who's here joining us today. So most of the faculty in child psychiatry know and admire Hector, but for those of you who might be less familiar with him, I'm going to give you a little bit of his background. So Dr. Bird was born and raised in Puerto Rico and then completed his undergraduate training in Michigan, medical school at Yale, and then he came to Columbia for residency. For the next 23 years, he was then the deputy director of the Division of Child Psychiatry at Columbia University. His academic achievements are remarkable and numerous. To name a few, he developed the first Spanish version of the Achenbach Child Behavior Checklist, which is one of the most common assessment measures used in child psychiatry. He was also a lead investigator on the MECA study. He was on the DISC working group. And most relevant for our Grand Rounds today, about 20 years ago, he launched the Boricua Youth Study, dedicating his research energy and career to understanding the development of psychopathology in Puerto Rican children. And most importantly, today is Dr. Bird's 80th birthday, so a very warm happy birthday to Dr. Bird. So we're gonna invite Dr. Bird up in a minute to give him a plaque for his achievements. But before doing so, I wanted to say a few words about today's speaker, Dr. Duarte, because I think that will give some additional context for Dr. Bird's legacy. So Cristiane is the Lambert Professor in Child Psychiatry at Columbia. She hails from Sao Paulo, Brazil, where she completed her undergraduate training and then her PhD in clinical psychology. Shortly after completing her PhD, she heard about a new study launching at Columbia University focused on mental health in Latino children, which was an area that she was very passionate about. So she contacted, or tried to contact, the principal investigator of that study, who was no other than our Hector Bird. And in 2000 or 2001, Cristiane came and joined Hector's team here at Columbia, and is now the principal investigator of the Boricua Youth Study. Since coming to Columbia, Cristiane's achievements have been exceptional. She has over 75 publications. She's been the principal investigator on multiple NIH-funded studies. Her achievements have been recognized with numerous awards, including the Outstanding Mentor Award from the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She's highly collaborative with projects in psychiatric epidemiology, gambling behavior, early neurodevelopment, cardiovascular health, and global mental health, just to name a few. And we'll be hearing today about her work in the Briqua Youth Study, again, that Hector Bird started. So I'd like to invite the two of you up and present this plaque to Dr. Bird.
Looks fancy.
There you go. We're going to take a few pictures. You're in the middle, maybe?
Thank you. Can I just say a few words?
Yeah, please.
Yes. As you well know, these very complicated studies are never a single person achievement. And I really would like to recognize, at the time that we received the study, NIMH would not allow 3 principal co-investigators to go into the study, but there were 3 of us, and it was myself, it was Dr. Glorisa Canino in Puerto Rico, and Dr. Rolf Lober at the University of Pittsburgh. And we got this grant with a great deal of effort, not the least which was Rolf Lober and Magda Stauthammer's Lober contribution in terms of providing us with many of the measures that they had used in the Pittsburgh Youth Study that have been used in our investigation. So I really don't want to take all the credit, but I really appreciate this. And the greatest appreciation I have is that the study that we started here has really blossomed and has led to so many publications and so many people getting interested and so many K awards and so on. So that it's really that's the biggest reward that I think we get from the study that we've done. Cristiane came to me when Dr. Bourdin, who I had met at a meeting, sent me a letter and she said, I have this very outstanding PhD who wants to do a research fellowship, and she's paid by the government of Brazil. So of course, I went, I went to David Schaffer and he said, a free research fellow, bring her in, And little did I know that Cristiane was really such an outstanding scientist that when I decided that, as I usually do, I do things because I feel like it. And I decided I was going to retire and we're going to move back to Puerto Rico and so on. I thought to myself, this study can't be just left standing. So who should I hand the study over to? And I said, Cristiane. So Cristiane took over and she has really made the tree of science grow. And there are a lot of ramifications, and there are too many people here that I would have to thank, and it's not Golden Globe or Oscar ceremony. So, but Christina Hoven and Prudence Fisher and all the others, Maddie Gould, the late, Dr. Lober, who passed away last year. So many people have been involved in this that I really think everyone is deserving of the recognition. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Melvin. You have the Directors Guild membership. Wait, one more.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Jonathan, for this kind introduction. I'm really thinking that I shouldn't spend another 20 years without giving grand rounds if it's so much fun and if you're going to be introduced the way I have been by Jonathan and Hector as well. So, but it is true that I could not ask for a better day to be here with you talking about our work than today. Today, that is Hector Bird's 8th anniversary and a day when we have an event like the Kenneth Ford Diversity Alliance event. So it's people like Dr. Bird, and you'll hear even more about his accomplishments as I proceed with the talk, and also initiatives like the Alliance initiative that makes me believe that we may have a chance of breaking the cycle of childhood adversity and really making a difference in the lives of children that we are so devoted to. I have no conflicts of interest, and these are, just want to acknowledge that our funding has been all from NIH at this point. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to start by talking about just describing what adverse childhood experiences are and how they are recently being defined and operationalized, and why a focus on those experiences can be so important if we're interested in improving the lives of children, of disadvantaged or vulnerable children. I will then proceed to present some findings from the Boricua Youth Study, where we have looked at the relationship between ACEs and psychopathology and other developmental outcomes from childhood to young adulthood, and with a keen interest on what are protective processes that could change the trajectories of the lives of those children. And finally, I will talk to you about how we have an ongoing initiative with my colleagues Catherine Monk and Jonathan Posner that we have, and Clarissa Canino, of expanding our reach in the way that we understand childhood adversities and thinking about the next generation. So let's start with a very basic definition that has been used a lot to conceptualize adverse childhood experiences, usually based on this study that was done now, unbelievable, but more than 20 years ago. Childhood adverse experiences have been conceptualized as different types of abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual, different types of neglect, and also household dysfunction, which includes parental mental illness, incarceration in the household, domestic violence, substance abuse, and divorce. Usually, interestingly enough, those experiences are, in the way that they were initially proposed, they are almost invariably based on a retrospective report of adults reporting on what had happened in their childhood, and also based on retrospective report, and also based on only 10 different questions, which is, for us, many of us here that have spent our careers interested in understanding experiences of children, it sounds like a very, very reductionistic approach, but it has had many advantages, and I will try to convince you of that by showing that those 10 experiences so simply conceptualized, they actually have been related to many, many different outcomes, not only psychiatric or behavioral outcomes, but also physical outcomes, including heart disease, cancer, stroke, and even broken bones. So that has given us a currency to think about the impact, about the impact of the environment on development that we can share with other disciplines. And I will say that that has had many advantages in terms of what we can learn across different types of disorders and with other colleagues. Needless to say, those childhood experiences also seem to have a very strong, important impact in terms of reducing life expectancy, for example, and a clear economic cost as well, justifying us looking at them in more detail. Actually, we now have almost all states in the United States are collecting information as part of the CDC study on ACEs. Also important for us to keep in mind, those adverse childhood experiences are not rare. This is results of a national study, the BRFSS, in which, as you can see, for some of those experiences, like emotional abuse, about a third of the population has experienced at least one of instance of emotional abuse, and that is also very common, parental separation or divorce, and also substance abuse, for example. There are very many, numerous studies showing the association between childhood adversities and psychiatric disorders. What I'm showing you here is national data from focused on adolescents, and as you can see, having any one of those experiences is related to an increased rate of having any psychiatric disorder in adolescents, and there are many, many studies like this. We also know that childhood adverse experiences are related to specific biomarkers and have some molecular correlates that are being investigated. So, for example, we know that children exposed to adversities have a dysregulation of the stress response system, the HPA axis. There are changes in the brain, changes in neurotransmitter systems like the CRF, and short telomere length has also been described. Several epigenetic changes in genes that are related to HPA axis and neuroplasticity-related methylation patterns, like changes in the FKBP5 gene, all suggesting that there is an impact of those experiences on development of those biomarkers. And finally, also, a lot of information has been generated lately about the role of inflammation in relation to those experiences. Importantly to say, and that's one of the main reasons why we're very interested in those experiences, that they are more frequent among racial ethnic minority individuals, particularly here in this data set, multiracial, but also Hispanics. These differences are significant, and also low SES populations. So really justifying that understanding better those experiences can have an impact on the lives of the children that we're interested in. So with that in mind, I will start describing to you the Boricua Youth Study, which has focused on two disadvantaged populations in two sites, living in two different contexts, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the South Bronx in New York City. These are about 2,500 children. So for the children to be enrolled in this study, they needed to be between the ages of 5 to 13 at recruitment and have a caretaker, at least one caretaker of Puerto Rican background. So this study, conceptualized by Hector Bird and colleagues, has this very unique design and went on for 3 yearly waves initially, so addressing the childhood and early adolescence period with a retention rate after 3 years of about 85%. And then more recently, at the end of 2017, we finished a 4th wave of assessment, which was done about 11 years after the 3rd wave ended, and we also obtained a very good compliance rate. And there are 2 ancillary studies that are going on right now. So I think you heard a bit already about this, but Hector Bird was the person who had the vision to do this and to do this way, which I think is as close to perfect as I could imagine, and creative also with this 2-site design where we have a population, the same population in 2 different contexts. One, a context in which the children are a racial ethnic minority, which is in the South Bronx, with all the disadvantage that we have in the area, in the study area, which is actually the 3rd poorest congressional district in the United States, and the same population in another context, which is San Juan in Puerto Rico, where also poverty levels are extremely high, but they don't have the experience of being a racial ethnic minority. Just to give you an idea about the breadth of this study, it's a representative sample of this highly disadvantaged area in the South Bronx. What you see here are the census block groups that were randomly selected to represent the population. And there's a interesting story here to tell. So when the sampling design was made, it used the 1990 census as its basis. And what happened was that when the study went into the field in 2000, a lot of the Puerto Rican population had moved out of the Bronx. So to get the 1,100 children that ended up being enrolled in the study, I always say that Hector Bird had to knock into 15,000 doors to find the children that were eligible for the study. But now we do have a representative sample of a highly impoverished area. In Puerto Rico, as you may imagine, this was a little easier because most kids, when you knock at the door, they are of Puerto Rican background, so that was easier. But it's still the work that Dr. Glorisa Canino has done in terms of also guaranteeing representativeness of the sample in that site is really outstanding. Before we move forward, just want to contextualize the Boricua study in light of other US-based longitudinal child psychiatric epidemiologic studies for which we have published data about the prevalence and development of psychiatric disorders. So as you see, if we think sometimes that we have problems defining what a psychiatric disorder is or what adversities are, don't start talking to demographers about what a generation is. It's really not fun. So this is the best we could come up with, just also showing what are the generations that are represented in, in the different cohorts. And as you can see, now what I'm showing you are the cohorts in gray that have mostly, whose population is mostly majority or white. So as you can see here, most of the studies that are focused on minority youth either had ended a few years ago, or we have the Boricua study and the Pittsburgh girls study, which is also an outstanding study that comes from the Pittsburgh Youth Study that was funded by Ralph Lambert. So just to, again, acknowledge the vision that Hector Bird had and the importance of this type of resource for us to understand development of psychopathology among children, minority children. So just for you to see what we'll be talking about today. So these are the three waves. The children were in the initial waves between the ages of 5 to 15, and more recently, they were young adults at the fourth wave between the ages of 16 to 29. This is actually, therefore, our kids. We're not kids anymore, but we resist acknowledging that. This is one of our participants, while waiting for an interview, gave us this gift in our board. Is a graphic artist, and I think gives a very good idea of what developmental stage our sample is right now. In terms of the distribution of the sample in this fourth wave, as you can see here, now we are spread pretty much in many different areas. We have about 150 members of the cohort of the 2,500 who are in Florida now. Most people stayed in Puerto Rico, only 10% moved out, although this has changed after Hurricane Maria, we believe, but we don't have exact numbers at this point because it looks like the population is very much in flux in terms of Puerto Rico and coming to the US. However, in the Bronx, the rate of movement has been higher. We still have 50% of the original population in the South Bronx, and about 30% within a 100-mile radius, so kind of accessible but not very easy, and the rest, the other 20%, are spread around the country, mostly in the tri-state area, but in other places as well. I get a lot the question, how did we get an 80% compliance rate after all these years and with the spread of the population that we have? And the only thing I can say and attribute this is really to the work that our team does here and in Puerto Rico in terms of conveying to participants exactly the same message that I'm conveying to you today. So this is the source of information that we have to understand development, risk, and resilience among a disadvantaged group. And if we don't do it, nobody else would do it at this point. So we explain to our participants, it can't be your neighbor, you can't be replaced by anybody else. And we are very clear in how we convey that. And this is this outstanding team that shares the mission and shares the goals that makes this possible. I have no question about that. So with that overview, some of you may be asking, why are we focusing, what is the rationale for focusing on Puerto Ricans of selecting this specific group? So what I want to show here, this is a landmark study by Dr. Margarita Alegria that looked as a national sample of Latinos, and what she shows here is if you look at different types of disorders and compare Puerto Ricans with other Latino groups, systematically Puerto Ricans, who are in light green here, have higher rates of disorders, therefore justifying why we should be thinking about this group. There are many ideas of why that could be the case, even though it may sound a little counterintuitive if we think about the fact that Puerto Ricans, the citizenship status that they have in comparison to other groups. And so I'm going to proceed just to tell you a bit about what is the distribution of psychiatric disorders in this sample. So first time you're seeing here the rates of disorders across the first three waves, and we just put it all together just for you to see that the rates of internalizing and externalizing disorders initially in childhood across the South Bronx and San Juan did not vary very much when we looked at those kids in childhood. However, when we started looking at trajectories, things were a little bit different. This is a trajectory of disruptive behavior disorders, which included conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. And what we see here is that even though the rates start in a similar way as at the end of wave 3, because of the trajectory in Puerto Rico, the symptoms are going down, while in the Bronx they're staying the same. We do have more psychopathology, more DBD, disruptive behavior disorder in the Bronx than in Puerto Rico. And then fast forwarding 11 years, this is what we see. So now we can see very clear differences in rates of psychopathology comparing to Puerto Rico and the Bronx, particularly in relation to substance abuse, illegal substances. We don't see it for alcohol, which is interesting, mania, depression, and also GAD, and we see that for lifetime disorders and also for past year disorders, the story is the same. We also see, interestingly, some developmental differences. So what you have here are substance abuse disorders on top, depression and GAD here, Puerto Rico and the Bronx. And what do we see in terms of age groups? As age goes up in Puerto Rico, the rates of past year disorders seem to go up, kind of clearly, while in the South Bronx, it looks like there is this peak in ages 18 to 20 that we're trying to understand, and these are statistically significant, so it doesn't look like the pattern, the developmental pattern is the same, and we are really interested in trying to understand that. So with all of that said, I'm going to now focus on what are the relationship between exposure to adversities in childhood and psychopathology in the Boricua study, more specifically what we found. And here, what you're going to see, first of all, is that there is a higher rate of adversities in the Boricua study compared to two different national samples, particularly if you look here, the rate of divorce and separation is almost twice as high as in a national adolescent and child sample, but also rates of other problems like adversities like physical abuse, emotional abuse, and parental emotional problems. So it is a group of children who have a higher risk of being exposed to those adversities. And this risk seems to be higher in the Bronx than in Puerto Rico, but it's high actually also in both sides. I'm just going to say one word about the way we measure ACEs in the Puerto Rico study. We actually used 3 different strategies to assess family dysfunction. We used the family history epidemiologic questionnaire, and then we have this is parental report, and for child abuse, neglect, and exposure to violence, which is an ACE that we added because we think it's so important for our population. What we do here is based on child self-report, and it's collected prospectively. So it's just what happened recently, which is very different from what is mostly in the literature. Very quickly, I just want to tell you that we mostly find what other studies have found, which is ACEs, having an ACE in childhood is related to having a psychiatric disorder in young adulthood. Here you see the odds ratios for tobacco dependence, illegal substance use, MDD, and GAD, or for any disorder. So we find that this relationship, except for alcohol and GAD, is marginally significant, adjusting for those covariates. So what we are really trying to understand, and that is more novel, and I would like to start bringing to you, is how ACEs are related not only to psychiatric disorders, but to other developmental, important developmental milestones and outcomes. So here, just examples of work that is being done on this area by our group. So we're looking how ACEs in childhood is related, for example, to pubertal development, sleep, sensation seeking, and early alcohol use. And in young adulthood, sexual risk behavior, suicide attempt, and perceived stress. As I said, this is only possible due to a group of committed investigators that are very interested in the question and have come to us with really important and interesting ways of addressing this relationship. I'm very hard to summarize all this work, but I just wanted to show you a few things that are interesting. So if we look at, these are outcomes, and these are different types of childhood adversities, and what you see here is how different types may be related to different outcomes. And very interesting, what we're starting to see is that it looks like girls may be more sensitive to the impact of those factors than boys. But we are still trying to understand what that may mean and if this holds. Another way that we have looked at ACEs, this is work by Claudia Lugo-Candela in our group, also postdoc in child psychiatry, is really trying to understand the cycle of adversity. So there is quite a bit that has been written demonstrating that ACEs are related to later ADHD. But what Claudia wanted to look at is, what about if ADHD are making kids more likely to be exposed to those adversities, and really thinking about the cyclical notion of those problems. And so here, she just confirmed what we all know. Cross-sectionally, just in one wave, there is a relationship. The more ACEs you have, more likely you are to have ADHD, so very clear. And here what she did was she looked at ADHD in the first wave, and she looked at how likely it was to predict incident ACEs, meaning ACEs that happen at waves 2 or 3, controlling for ACEs at wave 1. And very interestingly, she still finds a significant relationship even when she takes out ADHD that happen at waves 2 or 3, which could be caused by the new ACEs, so the chicken egg there is very hard to disentangle. So even when she takes those out, she finds this relationship. And more interesting, even this relationship is mostly with the inattentive ADHD type, which, many hypotheses here, are kids of the inattentive type more likely to be identified, or also more likely to misread their environment in terms of what are difficult relationships, and also the relationship with parents and how that could be impacted by ADHD. So with all that said, I want to focus a bit at protective processes and resilience in our sample. So if we had started this study a few years earlier, actually Justice Sonia Sotomayor could have been in our sample. She is a Latina Puerto Rican woman she's of Puerto Rican background, and she lived exactly in our catchment area. So she could have been in the study, and we know she has been public about the adversities that she has endured in life, and the trajectory, successful trajectories or trajectories where adversities do not lead to psychiatric disorders or other problems are also a big goal that we have. And I'm just going to give you a glimpse of how we are looking at those issues. So, for example, this is work by Dr. Alegria, where she compared the minority status, which means living in the South Bronx, and how it's related to higher rates of depression. And she found some interesting mediators. All these protective mediators, very interestingly, they are in childhood still. They are not in young adulthood. They are not the proximal factors, but they are peer relationships and social support. So really indicating that there are specific factors that we could focus on in order to alleviate the burden of these relationships. We also looked at, this is another paper that looked at the culturally specific protective factor that is familism. And interestingly, again, sorry about that. We see an increase that kids who have a family that is very focused on has a high value for the importance of family and centrality of family in their lives. Those kids, particularly older girls, they have a lower risk of antisocial behaviors compared to other kids. And so here also giving us some hints about the situation with girls, that they may be more sensitive to the risks, but they also may be more sensitive to the protective factors, which is good news. And I'm just going to end that piece about protective factors by talking to you about, again, a unique factor that may be relevant for Latino children, therefore that we may not look a lot in other samples or be able to. This is work by Chang Wei in our group. And what she wanted to do is look at how parental risks may impact parenting and lead to externalizing behaviors. This is a fairly well-known, well-studied model in child psychiatry, child psychology, although surprisingly to us, not that a lot of evidence for the longitudinal mediation model. But what she really wanted to do, important to say that this relationship between, if we improve parenting, we can alleviate externalizing behaviors. This is a very we are very good at doing that. We are very able of breaking this relationship with our interventions, particularly if we start very early in life. So her question is, if we are thinking about cultural stress, which is stress related to being discriminated against, that those children experience, we had shown that in an earlier paper, would that impact this type of relationship? And interestingly enough, what we found was that if this is a structural equation lagged model, that earlier waves did predict subsequent waves effects in the direction of her mediation model. So parental risks were related to problems in parenting and antisocial behavior. So the mediation model was supported by this data. And more than that, also an interaction with cultural stress in parenting was found, meaning that they were interfering with youth and antisocial behavior. And in a way, as you see here, even if you have high effective parenting, our interventions are working. We're changing parenting. If the youth has cultural stress, their antisocial behavior is not going to go as low as a youth that has just average cultural stress. So really indicating to us that we need to move towards incorporating this knowledge into our interventions. And work that we have been doing this direction, I'm just going to give you a glimpse of this is work that we're doing in the Youth Anxiety Center in the Washington Heights Clinic, where our mission is exactly to try to, as fast as we can and as best as we can, to translate knowledge about what factors are relevant, particularly for vulnerable children of diverse backgrounds. How can we translate that into improving our interventions and make them more tailored to those children? And so this is what we're doing here in Washington Heights. And I also want to give you a note about what we are trying to do also under the leadership of Dr. Milton Weinberg in Mozambique. We have our colleagues here visiting today. Thank you so much for being here, in which we are also trying to see how we can improve the mental health system of care in the country by taking into consideration what are the important risks that we need to think about. And now I get to the last part of my presentation, in which I'm going to talk to you about how we can extend our prevention capacity and go towards the next generation. So basically what we are doing here, you have, let's say that we are the Puerto Rican children that we have been evaluating for this last 20 years, and here what you see are the second generation, what we call G2. This is called the Boricua Youth Study, Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes, a mouthful, or for short, we call it BYS ECHO, and as I mentioned, is being done in collaboration with those colleagues. I just want to give you, this is part of a national collaboration, which is the ECHO study that has it as its main goal to enhance the health of children for generations to come. What you see here is ECHO is very ambitious in the sense of trying to look at different types of exposure and different types of outcomes, and also very interested in understanding positive health or positive outcomes to make a difference as part of a national initiative on the lives of children. So there are cohorts in ECHO in 44 states. You can see them here, and a really huge support network for the activities that are being done as part of ECHO. The main message is that a good start to life can last a lifetime. So in that sense, it's very coherent with the work that we have been doing, and we're very glad to be part of this national initiative. The specific question that we're trying to answer as part of ECHO is how adversity in parents' childhood may affect the next generation even before birth, and what are the high-risk the factors that could protect high-risk children. So we're doing that from pre-birth, starting 2 weeks to age 10. Very convenient that my daughters were exactly reproduced the lifespan of ECHO. I'm glad for that. These are our main hypotheses and potential mechanisms. So basically, and this is our main hypothesis, is that what happens in parents' childhood will have an impact in the next generation, independently of exposure to maternal stress during pregnancy, independently of what the postnatal rearing environment is. So we're not denying that those are important influences, but we think that we can still see an impact of parental childhood exposure. These are potential mechanisms: change in parental caregiving, changes in the gestational environment, and epigenetic changes also that could make also fathers very likely to be important transmitters of those experiences. So this is a recently published paper by Pamela Scorza that really looks how important it may be to consider those exposures that happen in childhood across a lifetime, and how that can actually have impact across multiple generations. So just to be very clear, so I think I showed you quite, and there is a lot of evidence, I hope to have convinced you that if a child is exposed during childhood in the postnatal period, at some point, that there are going to be consequences exposed to adversities to brain and behavior. We didn't go in the brain so much, but there is a lot of evidence about that. Also a lot of evidence that if that exposure happens during pregnancy, and Dr. Monk has outstanding work in this area, there are also going to be consequences. But what we're really interested in understanding is, and I'm sorry, I also showed you how the biological processes, there are biological processes that we know are involved in this, possibly. But we really want to understand how exposure in the prenatal period may be important, and acknowledging that there are many other factors that are participating here that could be alternative explanations or additional risks, like your genes, parental life stressors, parental behaviors, maternal pregnancy, and stressors and other protective factors. So we are not forgetting about those. But our focus and novel hypothesis is that really what's happening in the parent's childhood is going to have an important impact. And we also want to extend our understanding of what the biological process would be to that timing of exposure, if you will. And that's important because exposures are happening all the time, and this is one example of an additional series of risks that may impact the development of children in Puerto Rico for years to come that we are trying to see how we can understand as well. So just going back to this is what we are trying to understand, and that's how we prolong the Boricua study to the next generation. So now our population, our kids, adults are between the ages of 20 and 33, which is, as you see here, these are the birth rates in the United States by mother's age, and you see that the ideal age where the birth rate is the highest between 20 and 30, which is exactly the age that our population has. Therefore, this is the ideal time to try to do what we're trying to do. We're being quite ambitious, and I learned from the best in the sense that we want to assemble a full cohort out of the original 2,500 BYS cohort. So we want to be able to recruit in our sample every single child that has ever been born out of the cohort, plus every child that will be born since 2017, that's when we started, until 2023, when we end. And that's what we are trying to do in the echo piece of the study. As you can see here, we are also trying to enroll what we call the G1 non-BYS parents. I know the terminology is hard. I will not quiz you on this after this, but it's basically the spouses of BYS are also, original BYS are also now starting to be part of the study, and that's, we're hoping to enroll about 1,300 children. And we already have, I think, close to 500 at this point. We are doing different types of assessments, as you can see here. That includes, and it's also related to the national study that is being done, interviews, assessments, and collection of biospecimen. Our focus is on executive functioning, that we think is a nice focus to have if we're really interested in processes across development. If we know that executive functioning is impacted by childhood adversities, predictive of a series of future outcomes, including psychiatric disorders, and most importantly, amenable to interventions. I'm just going to give you a slight peek of what we have found. Very, 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 very preliminary findings. This is with initial sample. As you see, we are also seeing in terms of childhood adverse experiences by parents. We are reproducing the same information that I showed you before. It's higher in the Bronx than in Puerto Rico. These are our original BYS parents, and something that not sure if this is going to still be true with the full sample, but what we are seeing now is that the spouses of our BYS sample, they seem to have actually a higher rate of exposure compared to Puerto Rico, but also to the original sample, which sadly that may mean that the G2 generation may be more exposed, and that could be one of the cyclic processes that we will see happening over time. This is from Dr. Posner's lab, showing that number of maternal ACEs in a few babies, about 30 babies already enrolled in our study, with brains beautifully segmented, baby brains. Here they are between 2 weeks and 3 months. And what you see here is that the number of, as maternal ACEs go up, there is a decrease in infant brain connectivity. This is, again, in the dorsal prefrontal cortex area, which is related, as we know, to executive functions. So this makes sense, and it's supports our hypothesis. One of the reasons why we feel comfortable showing this to you today is because this is a parallel study. It's a pilot study, actually, that we are doing in Brazil, and we find very similar results. This is not related, is related to physical abuse specifically. As the rate goes up, you also have decreasing connectivity also in the prefrontal cortex area. Again, these are only 30 babies, but this is preliminary data that we used actually for a submission that Jonathan Posner is leading with Andrea Jakowski in Brazil and myself, where we are trying to understand in a sample that is in the public universal healthcare system in Brazil, in a very deprived area, trying to understand development. And because this is kind of a closed system, it's much easier to get access to the population and collect the information that is needed. So what we are being able to do in this study is to refine a bit this bar here about the biological processes that are involved, so we have more specific hypotheses about and want to understand how childhood ACEs may have, unfortunately here it's retrospectively reported, may have impacted maternal inflammation, leading to placental epigenetics changes, and then impacting offspring outcomes, particularly in the brain. So this link nobody has made yet, and we think the field is ripe to do it. We'll see. But we are very excited. It's going to be reviewed next week, I think, right, Jonathan, or something? And so I'm just going to finish by proposing that we really think seriously about intergenerational transmission in psychiatry. And if we do that, I think there are many, many advantages that we have. First of all, we have plenty of animal evidence that intergenerational processes occur in psychiatry. This is Dr. Mann's work, in which adult female macaques had hypo-responsive to an intruder if the mother had stressful life events, even though those macaques were typically reared. So we've seen that work. Rodent models have shown very prolific work showing that the molecular biology of perceptions of the condition of the environment is altered for when one is exposed to adversities, have shown some long-term programming effects of those exposures, evidence of the inheritance and transmission of information to the next generations. And what I think is really the most exciting, this is a recent paper that has shown also that the plasticity of those processes. So in this case, extinction training has reversed, this was olfactory fear conditioning effects that were intergenerationally transmitted. So this could have was seen. So not only the next generation did not have, after the extinction training anymore, behavior or anatomic changes, but also they demonstrated that the epigenetic marks in the first generation were gone. So that, I think, gives us a lot of hope that what we are doing could be really change processes. And finally, I just want to give a word about what is the evidence that we have for, in terms of human evidence that we have for intergenerational transmission in psychiatry. And then obviously everything starts with the seminal work of Myrna Wiseman, the 30-year three-generation study of risk of depression, showing us that those psychiatric disorders, yes, they run across generations, and some of the processes that may underlie that in the most interesting way, and in the time that we are, where we now have polygenic risk scores, and we probably will be able to understand that much better in the years to come. And also the seminal work of Rachel Yehuda showing, now focusing on the intergenerational transmission of trauma and what are possible epigenetic mechanisms that we have not yet demonstrated that exist, are in place in humans. But very interesting and important work, although we would claim that a focus that is more on adversities rather than on trauma specifically could be more meaningful for the populations that we are interested in understanding. So I just want to finish by saying that I believe there is a confluence of factors that is happening right now, and that we should thinking seriously about intergenerational psychiatry as an important area of inquiry. Is it time for us to widen the lens? And in terms of our research question, the way this plays out is we should be able to think beyond prenatal and childhood exposure to stress. So to date, most studies and developmental theories have assumed that a child's own experience of adversity, those experiences are primarily influencing future negative outcomes. However, maybe we need to broaden the lens. The intergenerational and cyclic nature of this advantage suggests the possibility that the effects of adversities may extend well beyond the exposed child and influence the offspring through a number of potential sources. So if we invest in a perspective of exposure that takes that into account, I think we have a chance of understanding etiological processes in psychiatry better, improving our understanding, and also have a huge public health impact. So I'm just going to finish saying that this is not done by, it doesn't take a village, it takes many villages to do that, and I hope I have convinced you that it also takes generations for this type of work to be done, and I'm very proud of being part of these groups and thankful to everybody who has been part of this. So thank you.
So thank you so much, Cristiane. That was really a remarkable talk and an extraordinary body of work. And so I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions.
I have three comments to make or question to ask. Oh, first, feliz cumpleaños to Hector. The first is a comment. I mean, something like this is really just extraordinary to see just the breadth and depth of the work, the sweep and the potential impact, but also the fact that it signifies several things about Columbia and NISP, which is the extraordinarily high-quality, multidisciplinary approach, the continuity and tradition of maintaining it and passing the baton research-wise, and that's just so impressive to see, and it doesn't exist in enough places, but is particular to what historically has occurred here. So congratulations to all who've done this. The second thing is that, there's been so much talk about CRISPR and the ability for it to do, instead of God or naturally designed offspring, to have some intelligent, scientifically designed offspring. So this is kind of the obverse or the other side of that coin, which is, can you manipulate the environment in ways that can have an influence? And it can occur, as you say, gestationally, postnatally, during childhood, and then intergenerationally. So the question is that going to get into the same kind of controversy about, I mean, it seems like who could object to reducing childhood adversity or stress factors on women who are pregnant, or families that are expecting, but it is verging on social engineering, which in this country is viewed with askance in many cases because of the premium of individual expression, self-determination, personal autonomy, hands off from big brother or sister. So obviously, they shouldn't stand in the way of the research that's going on, but these are things that I wonder if you thought about or have opinions about as the results begin to come out and the implications are seen.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, it would be very different to the way we conceptualize and the way we can intervene also. It's much more less specific than the changes in genes, and that I think at this point has a lot of, there's no reason why anybody would oppose to that. I think if we move forward this line of research in a way that it's kept as meaningful to the end goal, that is to improve children's or adults as well, lives, and that is part of the process, I think we don't run as much the risk that genetic research that comes from a different perspective has run. So that would be my my answer to your question. I can see it's hard to answer to a question, but I think it comes from very different places, and that's.
Well, first, that was absolutely stunning.
Thank you, Myrna.
it was
You were
beautiful.
too kind.
Yes. But I think Jeff raises a good point. Is this engineering, social engineering? Well, it could be, but there's a lot that can be done before you even call it social engineering. It's calling having available treatment.
Yeah.
And that's legitimate, and nobody argues that it's a bad thing to do. On the other hand, available treatment at a very early age is something that could be done, and that's a matter of having money to do it and having programs. And in fact, some of the programs that members of this department are doing in Mozambique would be absolutely wonderful
Yes.
to have in New York City.
Exactly.
And those are not expensive, they're not controversial, they just need to be implemented.
And they might very well.
And just to finish, you showed that there's symptoms. These kids have symptoms, there are problems. So that's fairly legitimate. When you start getting into education and parenting, maybe then you start dealing with values. But treating early symptoms, very early, when you know the disorders begin, that's a reasonable thing to do and could be done.
Thank you, Myrna. I think you are actually the ideal person that can really recognize how what we're doing at the level that we're doing could be thought about and linked to treatment in a very effective and positive way. And your life's work tells us that, and thanks for all of that. I mean, very inspirational.
I don't know if you showed this. What are the implications? I don't know if you showed, what are the implications for antisocial behavior in the correctional system?
That's a very, very good question. I think we are trying to understand now antisocial behaviors in the in young adulthood, and that's a step that we are moving towards. But I think the developmental aspect of those problems is very clear. So one implication is that there are many places where we could intervene before we get to the correctional system. So I think that's very important. There are implications for how we could intervene with the parents to prevent involvement of their children with the future correctional system. So I think if we think about this intergenerationally, we start being able to really achieve our prevention potential. It becomes a lot broader than we have had. I've called this before, I know it's strange, as pre-prevention. So can we think about it that way? And if that's a reality, the fact that it takes potentially a generation may not be a deterrent, quite the opposite. This window that we have to intervene is much broader.
What a great talk. You
Sorry.
really did just a masterful job of presenting all this great work. And I just want to emphasize what you and Myrna were just discussing, which, and I guess Jeff really initiated, is this really indicates the possibility of real prevention. And if we, in sitting with an adult patient, it can be used clinically as well to think that from a life course perspective, the problems they're bringing to you are accumulated from not only their life course, but potentially their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so with this ingenious prospective study that was started so long ago, that there's this prospective data to really make a link between someone's childhood and then how their children are doing is hopefully going to be phenomenal evidence to work with policymakers and get some money for the kind of interventions that Myrna can do that are really accessible and doable, and really start to do preventative work for the person and help them and then the next generation, where that's where the prevention is.
Yeah, thanks for this comment, Catherine. That's absolutely the way we would like to be able to go.
Passing.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that wonderful talk. And I guess I have two lines of inquiry for you. One, both sort of theoretical, and as you may or may not remember, I run our women's mental health program, so focused a lot on maternal mental illness and interventions there, and also a program about intimate partner violence, where we end up seeing a lot of parents and see directly the effects of trauma. And, through the IPV work, which goes, and I think it goes along with a lot of the ACEs work that you showed, that you demonstrated in terms of childhood diversity and risk for later psychopathology, you see that in adults too. For example, in the NESARC data about exposure, past year exposure to IPV and risk of new onset psychopathology. Mm-hmm. So, my sort of theoretical question is around, and the other aspect of it is that in doing trauma work, you see a lot of misdiagnosis and treatments that are unfortunately end up being pathologizing rather than healing from traditional models. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you have thoughts about how this type of work of the connecting the dots between childhood adversity, later adversity, and risk of psychiatric diagnosis, both, probably both validates and also challenges our actual conceptualization of psychiatric diagnosis, of the categorical diagnoses we are working with. My second, more of a comment, is absolutely. I focus on treatment and the importance of treatment for those already affected by these, horrible events and the way that they affect their children. That's certainly part of the mission of our program. But I wonder too how this work that you're showing can get beyond the sort of idea of treatment interventions, and into more of a broad understanding on a public way about how our systems are actually harming our culture, in fact, and the future of our, this is a little bit grandiose, but the future of our society in some ways. So do with that what you will. Thank you.
Okay. I think, actually, my view, the two questions are not that different in the sense that we may really need to move forward, and there are health systems that are already moving towards a more, taking more seriously the need to identify and understand these exposures as part of how we conceptualize health and how we conceptualize interventions, prevention or treatment. So I think if we are more serious about doing that, I think we really can blur some very pervasive but not helpful barriers that we have between what is a disorder and what is not, and really understand and help people at the time of the exposure or as they move forward in that trajectory that we know is of risk. And then in that case, it's what we're treating is treatment as prevention in that sense. So I think that becomes, depending on how we look at it, very different, but I believe possibly very impactful way of doing what we do if we take seriously and understand how those exposures really impact development later on. So I don't know if answers, but.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. Blair?
Hi, Cristiane, just to echo a beautiful talk. And I know that, you sort of minimize yourself a little bit, and I appreciate that you are part of a generation, but to host and to be the head of a project like this with all those teams takes a very special person. And from working with you, I know you are that very special person, so you are a good next generation. If I don't know Hector, maybe Hector was that type of person too, but you are very much that type of person. And I think all the people who work with you are very glad for that, because it takes a lot to bring together an interdisciplinary team like this. But my question to you was, a couple months ago, we all saw this very provocative talk by Kim Noble about the impact of poverty on the brain, and then her project, which is basically like, let's just not do interventions, let's just give people money. And so she's now testing, if you just give people, randomize people to poor people to money or no money, do you make a difference in their kid? And looking at your work, I'm thinking, how much are you also looking at poverty as a factor, but then also the emergence out of poverty, and does that impact the next generation? And I imagine you and she are talking a lot, but I just see a lot of really interesting parallels for, if you will, it's another way of expanding the scope.
Yeah, no, definitely. And actually there is kind of a debate. There are some people who want to conceptualize poverty as one adverse life experience, and some people who don't think that that's a good idea, because we kind of lose the fact that poverty is behind or usually a very common experience to most people who experience lots of adverse life experiences, but it's a different processes. And then there are advantages of keeping them separate, although always considering when you're talking about, but in terms of what the intervention would be, there may be some differences. However, and I hope the to context design of the study that we have, as it illustrates, we need to look at what context we are working and what is the background level of advantage or disadvantage. But I fully agree with you that if we can join those different types of understandings of what is a risk and how that risk specifically can be reverted. So it could be money, and that may make a huge difference. And what's the impact of that on the adversities? That is, I think, fascinating to try to understand.
And it may be that you have a very unique design, again, not knowing the details, but what I imagine many of the people in Puerto Rico maybe, I'm assuming, are not removing themselves from poverty. And then the map you showed us in the United States, 50% of your sample, I think you said, was still in the South Bronx, but 50% has moved out. And I'm, again, assuming maybe if you moved to Pennsylvania, you made it, or you're less poor. So you might have a very unique sample to actually look at that trajectory.
Yeah, no, definitely. Although, just some news on that, we also, we thought, we're going to Florida, we're interviewing all these people in Florida who moved from the South Bronx, and we're thinking, oh, we're going to go to and see people in these mansions, and their lives are completely different. No, we're going to trailer parks, and this is something we're very interested in understanding also, to what extent staying in the South Bronx, actually, you maintain a sense of community and maybe even less risky. We don't have an answer for that yet, but I think a hypothesis like that are the ones that we're very interested in investigating. And thanks for your comment in the beginning, very generous. Nice of you.
Last question for
Cristiane, I have a question, a comment and a suggestion. So, when you do ambitious studies like this, you are going to be challenged by, consequences that are broad and daunting. So, you're identifying aspects of the environment that impact development, and they yield likely implications and sensible benefits if they were to be addressed in some way. And Myrna raised the question about treatment and how is treatment going to be provided to address these things? There's the social engineering point that I had made, where some things could be considered. there's also the public health approaches. So when, sanitation was introduced, when fluorine was put in water for teeth, when smoking was prohibited, and when obesity and, listing the ingredients and calories, these are public health, and lead was removed from gasoline paint. These are public health initiatives that had, amazingly beneficial effects and were, mostly acceptable. I guess there was people who thought the communists were putting the fluorine in the water, but the question is how to deal with the findings and how do they then get introduced into some policy, whether it's to provide more resources for mental health care so that IPT or treatments can be provided, or whether there's some public mental health initiative. So my suggestion is not to get ahead of yourselves and not to put yourselves in the line of fire. You think of, with your colleagues, Jonathan, Catherine, Hector, whoever else you want to engage, you think, Milton, you think of writing a thought piece about the ramifications of the results of this and what the possible opportunities that it would present would be, and what are the sort of considerations in terms of how to be able to act or not on those, just to sort of preempt. It's like when you write a grant, you always put in there the limitations so that you can't be criticized for what you haven't discussed. But I think, given the ambitious scope of this work and, its potential, political sensitivities, that it might be something that would be worth doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea, and I just also want to reinforce the notion also that what we are actually trying to do right now with the work in Mozambique and the work in Brazil is really to contextualize those findings and see what the implications could be in public mental health systems of care, where introducing changes is much more possible than here. And by doing that, demonstrating that some of those interventions, like simple parenting interventions or IPC and others, could really lead to substantial changes that could therefore be implemented in other more complicated systems. So that's a really important part of our work, and we are trying to write about it as we go, but I agree that this could be a really interesting way of doing it. But thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Okay, thank you.